What if I told you that one voice became so mesmerizing, so emotionally powerful, that a music critic in Japan compared it to the voices of mythical beings capable of stopping people in their tracks? Not idols, not celebrities, not even legendary singers, sirens, the mythical creatures from ancient Greek stories whose songs were said to hypnotize anyone who heard them. And somehow, after listening to BTS's Jin, that was the comparison people started making. Not because of visuals, not because of fame, but because of the feeling his voice leaves behind. And honestly, once you hear the full story behind this article, you start realizing this isn't just another compliment for Jin. This feels different. This feels like someone trying to explain something almost impossible to put into words. Because how do you describe a voice that doesn't just sound beautiful, but feels unforgettable? Today, we're diving deep into the emotional article that has fans across Korea, Japan, and all over the world talking about Jin in an entirely new way. And trust me, by the end of this story, you may never hear his voice the same way again. So let's talk about what happened. A Japanese music critic named Ken Kagaya recently published a column through the Japanese media outlet Real Sound. But this wasn't some short review praising Jin for a few high notes. No, this was a full artistic analysis connecting BTS's Netflix documentary BTS The Return and the group's fifth studio album Arirang to one of the most legendary stories in human history, the Odyssey. An ancient Greek epic about journeys, survival, longing, temptation, sacrifice, and finally, finding your way home. Already, that's an incredibly deep comparison. But then something fascinating happened. As Kagaya analyzed the structure of the album and documentary, one element kept pulling his attention back over and over again. Jin's voice. Not just his singing ability, not just technique, his actual presence through sound. And suddenly the article transformed from a music review into something almost poetic. According to Kagaya, the repetitive emotional structure of the title track Swim reminded him of the ancient songs performed by traveling storytellers centuries ago. Imagine that visual for a second. Ancient bards singing stories beneath the stars, songs carrying emotion from one generation to another, voices becoming memory itself. That's the atmosphere he connected to BTS's music. And at the center of that emotional storytelling, Jin. But what truly shocked fans was how specifically he described Jin's vocals. The article mentions the very beginning of the documentary. That simple greeting, hello. Just one word. One tiny moment most people would overlook instantly. But Kagaya described it as a beautiful voice that is transparent. Transparent. That's such an unusual way to describe someone's voice, isn't it? Because transparency isn't about power. It's not about volume, it's about purity, about emotion flowing through without obstruction. And honestly, that description fits Jin almost painfully well, because there's always been something emotionally naked about his voice. When Jin sings, it rarely feels like performance alone. It feels sincere. Even when he hits difficult notes, even when the arrangement becomes massive, there's still this fragile humanity underneath everything. Like you can hear the person behind the singer. And maybe that's why people become so emotionally attached to his voice. It doesn't feel distant. It feels close, comforting, warm, like someone reaching toward you emotionally through music. But then the article goes deeper. Much deeper. Kagaya explains that as the documentary progresses, Jin's deeper timbre in the later sections begins to complete the narrative. Think about how cinematic that sounds. Not carrying the narrative, completing it. As if the emotional journey itself becomes whole through his voice. And honestly, if you follow Jin's career for years, that idea hits incredibly hard. Because Jin's voice has always carried this strange emotional evolution. In earlier BTS years, many people focused on his visuals first. The worldwide handsome nickname became globally iconic. But over time, more and more people began realizing something important. Jin's greatest weapon was never just how he looked. It was how he sounded. Especially when emotion entered the song. Because once Jin connects emotionally to lyrics, something changes. Suddenly his voice stops sounding technical. It starts sounding lived in. And that emotional authenticity is exactly what this Japanese critic became obsessed with analyzing. The article literally says, Jin's voice captivates the listener instantly. Instantly. Not after several listens. Not gradually. The moment it begins. And then came the comparison that shook fans everywhere. Kagaya compared Jin's voice to the song of the Sirens. Now, if you know Greek mythology, you understand how powerful that symbolism really is. Sirens weren't simply beautiful singers. Their voices were irresistible. Their songs reached people emotionally before logic could intervene. The sound itself became impossible to ignore. And suddenly, doesn't that comparison make terrifyingly perfect sense for Jin? Because how many times have fans said the exact same thing? That one line from Jin suddenly becomes the part they replay endlessly. That one note suddenly becomes unforgettable. That one emotional delivery suddenly stays in their chest long after the song ends, especially his high notes. The article describes them as sweet as honey and clear like a silver bell. And honestly, that might still be an understatement, because Jin's high notes don't just sound clean, they feel luminous. There's this floating emotional quality in his upper register that feels almost unreal live. When he reaches emotional climaxes in songs, it's not just technically impressive. It feels vulnerable, like he's pouring every ounce of feeling directly into the note itself. And maybe that's why his voice affects people so deeply. Because emotional honesty is becoming rare, especially in an industry built around perfection. But Jin's voice still feels human, even at its most beautiful. And then somehow, the article makes things even more emotional. Because out of all songs to mention, Kagaya talks about Super Tuna. Yes, the chaotic, funny, wholesome song that exploded worldwide. And somehow, instead of treating it like a joke, the article uses it to reveal another side of Jin's artistry. Kagaya jokes that even the CG fish seem enchanted by Jin's voice. And honestly, that line says everything about Jin as a person. Because who else could create something so unserious and still make people genuinely emotionally attached to it? That duality is rare. Jin can make people laugh 1 second and completely emotionally devastate them the next. That balance is part of what makes him feel so magnetic. He never feels one-dimensional. He can be playful, chaotic, elegant, heartbreaking, comforting, powerful, sometimes all within the same performance. And then came the moment that probably affected fans the most emotionally. After publishing the article, Ken Kagaya shared additional thoughts on X, and this is where the mythology comparisons became even more intense. He wrote that Jin's beautiful voice could turn even goddesses into allies. Just pause for a second and absorb how dramatic that sounds. But somehow, it doesn't even feel exaggerated, because Jin has this strange emotional gravity around him. People don't just admire him, they feel protective of him, comforted by him, drawn toward him emotionally. And then Kagaya described Jin as both a siren and possessing the vitality of Orpheus. Now that comparison is enormous. Because in Greek mythology, Orpheus wasn't merely a musician. His music was said to move nature itself, trees, animals, even gods. His songs carried emotion powerful enough to transcend ordinary human experience. So imagine being compared to that because of your voice. Not because of marketing, not because of popularity, because of emotional impact. And then, Kagaya adds another layer. He mentions Jin's role during military service and describes him almost like a symbolic protector within BTS's larger journey. And suddenly, everything becomes emotional in a completely different way. Because now the mythology isn't just about beauty anymore. It's about endurance, responsibility, sacrifice, loyalty, strength during difficult periods. And if you followed BTS through the years, you know exactly why fans became emotional reading this. Because Jin has always carried this quiet, stabilizing energy within the group. Sometimes loudly funny, sometimes emotionally supportive, sometimes comforting without needing many words. And during uncertain periods, his presence often felt grounding for fans too. That's why hearing someone describe him as a mythical figure protecting the narrative of the team feels strangely accurate. Not exaggerated. Accurate. And honestly, maybe that's why this article resonated worldwide so quickly. Because it didn't talk about numbers, not charts, not awards, not sales. It talked about something harder to measure. The emotional effect of Jin's existence as an artist. The way his voice makes people feel safe. The way his tone can sound heartbreaking even during simple phrases. The way one note from him can suddenly make thousands of people emotional at the exact same moment. That's rare. Truly rare. And maybe that's why critics keep reaching for mythology when trying to explain him. Because ordinary language starts failing. How else do you explain a voice that feels comforting and devastating at the same time? A voice soft enough to feel intimate, but powerful enough to command entire stadiums? A voice capable of making people laugh through Super Tuna, and then emotionally destroy them through one vulnerable ballad? That contradiction is what makes Jin fascinating. And honestly, maybe that's the real reason people compare him to mythical figures. Because Jin never feels entirely explainable. There's always something slightly beyond description about him. Something timeless. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part of this entire story. In an era where trends disappear overnight, where music moves faster than ever, where people consume songs for seconds before scrolling away, Jin's voice made someone stop. Think deeply. Analyze mythology. Study emotional storytelling. Connect modern music to ancient epics written thousands of years ago. That kind of impact cannot be manufactured. It happens naturally, emotionally, humanly, and maybe that's why so many people feel attached to Jin without even fully understanding why. Because some artists entertain you, some impress you, some become famous. But every once in a while, there's an artist whose voice feels less like sound and more like memory. And perhaps that's exactly what Jin has become for millions of people around the world.